Welcome back to Artful Discussions at First Congregational Church, where I am spending some time with the different artwork around the building, especially as it relates to individual biblical passages and specific verses. So we're spending the series right now is covering the artwork by Charles Tuckfield in the church, and this one is referencing specifically Job 38:7. So I'll read starting at the beginning of verse 38, or chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Who is this darkening counsel with words lacking knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man, I will interrogate you, and you will respond to me. Were you there? Or where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you know. Who set its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring tape on it? On what were its footings sunk? Who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang in unison and all the divine beings shouted? Who enclosed the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, the dense clouds its wrap? When I imposed my limit for it, put on a bar and doors and said, you may come this far, no further. Here your proud waves stop. In your lifetime have you commanded the morning and formed the dawn of its place so it would take hold of earth by its edges and shake the wicked out of it. Do you turn it over like clay for a seal so it stands out like a colorful garment? Light is withheld from the wicked, the uplifted arm broken. Now this reading may seem a little bit strange if you're not familiar with Job in general. And where we're at in this story is Job has endured the inflictions that are imposed on behalf of God by the tempter, the Hasatan, or the advocate for God to some extent. And Job has seen these sort of sufferings. He has lost his entire family. He's lost his livestock, his property. And in the second round of sort of these afflictions, Job is afflicted with personal wounds and boils, and he's sitting on a lump of what they call dust and ashes, a reference to his condition and where he sits, waiting for his own death, I suppose. And then his friends show up, and there are 3 friends that show up, and we won't get into the details about that. And a 4th friend shows up later in the story. And they're telling Job that he must have done something wrong, that if all these things bad happened, there has to be a cause and effect of how these things happened. And Job is insistent that he didn't do anything wrong, which is, obviously that seems a little bit far-fetched. But nevertheless, he doesn't seem to have done anything wrong to warrant what happened. So their framework of sort of retribution just doesn't make sense, that it's too much. That what's happened to him is far greater than he could ever deserve. So, how could God be good if this is the result of that? And that's the question that Job is dealing with. Unfortunately, if you're looking for a solid final answer on where the author of Job comes down on that question, it's a little bit harder to find. But nevertheless, there is a final moment when Job, after early on cursing the day of his birth and waiting to die, eventually becomes so agitated at his friends and his situation that he says, you know what, I challenge God to show up, like in a court of law. I challenge you to convict me of something I did wrong. Prove yourself that what has happened to me was warranted. And so we get this first interaction of God showing up for the first time in chapter 38. And so we'll also get God showing up again and sort of challenging Job. You wanted me to show up, now deal with it. But that's sort of a different discussion. For now, though, it's really that God's argument in this setting at least from the author of Job, is really communicating to Job and to the reader that there's so much that we don't understand. There's so much that Job doesn't understand, that the idea that even if God explained how everything works and why things happen the way they happen, it wouldn't be sufficient, and it would be far beyond what Job could really gather, what he could understand. And so when I'm looking at this picture of this whale, and it looks like to me that there are birds. You can see sort of feet on top of the whale, and it seems that there's some sort of overlaid shapes. But there is this sense that the creation that we encounter, the world that we encounter, the ocean that we see, has so many incredible forces behind it. The waves and the tides and these massive whales and creatures of all kinds are way beyond our grasp to control, even if we are able to impact their world by our own activities and the way that we choose to live. But how did such sort of force that formed the oceans and made dry land from the oceans and formed continents from the seafloor pushing up out, how did all that come to be, and how could Job understand really the breadth and the depth of what's going on around him? It's somewhat of an unsatisfactory answer, that, at least from my perspective, that God shows up, especially because we, as the reader, know that God knew what was going on beforehand. It's a serious question in Job. How did God sort of allow or orchestrate this situation that Job finds himself in, and then just show up and gaslight him with this story about how wonderful creation is? It's a troubling story, but aside from like what we know as the reader and what Job knew as sort of the character in the story, I think it's an important distinction to make. That Job is trying to understand, why these things have happened to him, and trying to understand why God would allow or do these things to him. So maybe he suspects even more than we know. So anyway, there's a second piece of art sort of revealing that there is this source of life that is so much bigger than us, that the things that we encounter, the animals that we encounter, and once again, this, like, even down to these minuscule viruses that we encounter that have such ability and power in our world, even though they're microscopic, that there's just still so much that we don't understand. And even in the midst of sort of like tragic moments, I think it's helpful to to step back for a minute and recognize or appreciate just how vulnerable we are as human beings. How that we are somewhat precarious all the time, and that our lives sort of hang on these very unpleasant cliffs sometimes, and it can feel like it's out of control. So in this particular moment, when things do feel like they're out of our control, and it feels like we're confined in ways that might appear by the amount of traffic going on outside is unwarranted, but obviously is necessary because the thing that we're facing is so unseen. Seems like I just equated God with a virus. Maybe that's accurate. It'll be interesting to see how God shows up when we start asking big questions like Job. When we start asking, what do you want us to be? Who do you want us to be? In a world that seems quite full of danger and risk. What is it that you would say, God? All right, we'll see you around the church at our next art installation stop. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good evening.